but nobody else will remember this. But keep this in mind about Steve Stockman, who's one of the corrupt Republican congressmen who Trump just pardoned. Do you remember the Trump fundraiser and Republican Party official Elliot Broidy, who pled guilty himself in October to crimes involving illegal lobbying for foreign entities? Now, Elliot Broidy himself is not on tonight's pardon list. He's not getting pardoned yet. But weirdly, the cross between him and Steve Stockman, who was just pardoned, is that Steve Stockman, at one point, right before he went to prison, less than 2 weeks before he went to prison, Steve Stockman wrote to Elliot Broidy to tell him that Trump should give him an ambassadorship. Steve Stockman said that he wanted to be ambassador to the United Arab Emirates because he had, in his words, quote, many friends there. And he made the ask right before he went to prison on 23 federal felony counts. And now the Trump donor who he asked that favor of, who he asked to convey that request to President Trump, he is also now a federal convict awaiting his prison time, at least until he gets pardoned by President Trump, too. That's the Trump era. And that's Steve Stockman tonight, who is now enjoying his pardon. He was a Trump supporter all the while, regardless of whatever else was going on with him and his criminal record, and he's got his pardon tonight, too. President Trump tonight has also pardoned 2 people convicted in the investigation into Russia interfering in the 2016 presidential election that put Trump in the White House in the first place. George Papadopoulos, you see on your left here, he pled guilty to lying to federal investigators about his communications with a person who told him that the Russian government had dirt on Hillary Clinton that it might want to provide to the Trump campaign. He lied to federal investigators about that. He pled guilty to lying to them about that. He served a short prison sentence for that guilty plea. George Papadopoulos has just been pardoned by Trump tonight. Alex Vanderswan has also been pardoned tonight. He is the son-in-law of a powerful Russian oligarch. He pled guilty to lying to federal investigators about his contacts with a Russian intelligence officer to whom the Trump campaign secretly gave internal polling and strategy documents during the campaign. There has still never been any public explanation of why the Trump campaign chairman was giving internal, sensitive polling and strategic documents about the ongoing campaign to a Russian intelligence officer during the campaign while Russia was interfering in the campaign to help Trump. But Alex Vanderswan, when questioned about that by investigators, lied to investigators about his contacts with that Russian intelligence officer. And now he's just been pardoned. Did I mention that he's the son-in-law of a prominent and powerful Russian oligarch? The pardons for Alex Vanderswan and George Papadopoulos come, of course, after President Trump has already pardoned his national security advisor, Mike Flynn. Since his pardon, Mr. Flynn has advocated that the president should impose martial law across the country and somehow use military power to undo the election in which the president just lost to Joe Biden. Mr. Flynn required a pardon because he pled guilty twice to lying to federal investigators about his contacts with the Russian government when he was talking to them during the last presidential transition about the U.S. government putting sanctions on Russia for their effort to interfere in the campaign to put Trump in the White House. President Trump also already before tonight commuted the sentence of Roger Stone, who was convicted, among other things, of lying about his efforts to leverage the Russian intelligence operation that targeted the Clinton campaign in 2016 for maximum benefit to Donald Trump and his campaign. The pardon power is in the Constitution. It is black letter, clear power afforded to the executive in the Constitution. It's what they call a plenary power. It is a power so absolute and so daunting in its scope that in the American federal government, we only entrust that power to a single individual who is trustworthy and responsible enough to hold the awesome responsibilities of President of the United States. Turns out that power can also be used by someone like Donald Trump. And if he gets a hold of that power, it turns out he will use it for exactly what you think he will. He is there for 29 more days. The part of the Trump-era devolution and debasement of the office that includes the indiscriminate shower of pardons, that part tonight has begun. On the night, I should say, when the president is also now threatening to veto the COVID relief bill. Because if you're going to set the place on fire? Sure, why not? Make sure all the kids and pets and old folks are home and the doors are all locked from the outside before you throw in the match. Joining us now is Michael Schmidt. He's Washington correspondent for the New York Times. He shares a byline on the Times' reporting on these pardons tonight. Mr. Schmidt, Mike, it's really nice to see you. Thanks for joining us on such a busy night.
Thanks for having me.
Mike, let me just ask you, as this is sort of a developing story, do you have any more reporting on the discussions that went into tonight's pardons, why President Trump is issuing them now? We do note that he went through the somewhat unusual step of listing alongside the description of, the name and the description of each person who's being pardoned, he listed people who supported that pardon as if to sort of implicate them in his own decision to use his presidential powers to pardon them. Do we have any further understanding as to how he came to this list and why now?
What we're trying to understand at this hour is how many of these pardons came through the typical Justice Department process for recommending them. The Justice Department for many years has had this system to ensure that pardons are doled out for reasons of grace and mercy. They've had the system to ensure that there's a uniform process to it. We know that Trump has ignored that process in his past pardons, that he has gone off and done things on his own. He's allowed Kim Kardashian into the Oval Office to lobby him for pardons. And at first glance, when looking at these pardons tonight, it's clear that many of them don't even meet the basic criteria to receive a typical Justice Department recommendation for a pardon. So that means that they operated essentially outside the system, that anyone could have gone to the White House and lobbied the president, or Jared Kushner, or anyone else in the West Wing for these directly. And it's that type of lobbying that people say is concerning, because it allows the process to not be about grace and mercy. It allows it to be about connections and lobbying.
And, Mike, do we know anything about whether this big raft of pardons, if this is at all tied to the timing of Attorney General Barr's departure? His last day at the Department of Justice is tomorrow. He certainly had put some distance between himself and some of the more outlandish requests and demands from the president in recent days. The pardon power being used by the president in this way, as you say, perhaps not through any of the systematized processes of the Department of Justice. Are these the pardons that Barr is okay with? And so these are the ones that happen while he's still there? Do we know if there's any connection with the end of his tenure?
My guess is that there probably isn't, because it doesn't appear like the Justice Department was involved in many of these. This has been a very White House-driven process. This has been the type of thing that the president, because he has gotten rid of the typical way that pardons are looked at, it has allowed people to come in and to treat this as if they were lobbying for a company or lobbying for a bill. And the president obviously really entertains that. He likes it when people come up to him, whether it's at a campaign event or at one of his golf clubs, to ask him about this type of thing, to ask him about a pardon. It's something that the president can create instantaneous loyalty when he does. And because of that, if you look at the past numbers that he has granted, the pardons he has granted, of the 45 that he had granted up until today, 40 of the 45, 88%, were either tied to one of his allies, someone who had special access to him, or was tied to something that politically benefited him personally. That
piece of reporting, and in fact, perhaps even that soundbite of you saying that right here this night on the night of these pardons, will be, I promise you, used in a congressional hearing at some point in the future when some future Congress seriously considers whether or not within the Constitution they can reform the pardon process so that it cannot be used as a spoils system and essentially a bribery system by a sitting president, because that is just stunning. Michael Schmidt from the New York Times, a Washington correspondent for the Times, who's been following this breaking news all evening. Mr. Schmidt, thank you very much for your time this evening. I really appreciate it.